So, continuing our conversation on public goods, I'd like to talk a little bit about the provision of public goods and some of the nuances and quirkiness about providing something that you can't possibly exclude people from, or is non-rival, or has jointness in supply and consumption. Those properties of a pure public good that make them so that you can't provide them through sort of market forces the way that you can with private goods. And this ends up being really important because public goods are really central to a lot of the things that we try to provide in the international system through what we call global governance, whether that's dealing with environmental issues like the depletion of the ozone layer, dumping of chemicals into the oceans, or global warming. We could think about public goods in terms of disease management, or trying to stop the spread of invasive species. Research is oftentimes thought about as a public good, and that's something where you can have international collaborations around to kind of advance and take advantage of different specialties in research. Cybersecurity is increasingly a public good, where firms and governments are cooperating to try to shut down potential vulnerabilities to core software that's needed for the global system to function. And then lastly, economic stability has sort of a public good component. And so when it's trying to stabilize the global currency system, or whether it's trying to globally push out of a global recession, there's some public good elements to that. And across all of these, because there's that element of non-excludability, producing public goods can be challenging, because a lot of times these are things that are expensive. They take a lot of resources. They take a serious commitment of time and energy. And maybe I would rather other people make that investment of resources and time and energy and do it for me while I enjoy the benefits. Because again, public goods are largely non-excludable. I can access them. I can benefit from them whether I contribute or not. And if I'm tempted to do that, I might be tempted to free ride, enjoy the benefits without contributing to the overall cost of production. And because of this free rider problem, public good provision ends up being really hard, because everybody sort of does this calculation and concludes that they'd be better off if they didn't contribute and enjoyed the benefit all to themselves. But if everybody makes that calculation, everybody follows through on that action, everybody free rides, there aren't the resources provided to provide the public good in the first place, or not at the level that's desired or needed. And so we all end up collectively better off, even though we're all individually pursuing our rational self-interest. And so this is oftentimes the observation that pulls public goods provision into the conversation about the prisoner's dilemma, where I'm making a calculation individually about whether I contribute to an effort or don't contribute to an effort. And I have to sort of figure out if society is going to have enough contributions to be able to provide that public good, or whether society is going to fail. Too many people are going to free ride. We can think about that as cooperate and defect in the prisoner's dilemma language. And just like in the prisoner's dilemma, if I know that everybody's going to cooperate, I'm better off defecting, because I will get more resources by not contributing, by enjoying the public good, by free riding, and by enjoying my own private goods, my resources that I could have contributed, but instead I go and use for my own private benefit. But if I know that not enough people are going to contribute, why would I contribute? Why would I throw good resources after something that's going to fail? I'd be better off enjoying my private resources. And so just like the prisoner's dilemma, as an individual am thinking about this problem, I'm working the rational calculation saying, well, regardless what everybody else does, I'm better off free riding. And so we end up with not enough contributions. And I'd suggest to you that this problem actually even gets harder than our typical two-player prisoner's dilemma, which we can solve through iteration, right? That we learn through for TAT strategy, that if I cooperate and you cooperate, that this works and that this is a viable, sustainable pattern. But if I defect too much, that it sort of breaks apart. Oftentimes, public goods provision isn't involving just one or two people, only two people. Oftentimes we're talking about multiple actors, and the more actors you get involved, whether we're talking about dozens or hundreds of states, whether we're talking about thousands of firms, whether we're talking about millions of individuals, the more people who are involved in this effort to provide the public good, the harder it is to coordinate, the harder it is to monitor and make sure and identify who's cheating and who's free riding, to put social pressure on them, to push them to actually follow rules. And because of that, you get a greater temptation to free ride, that I can do this without any potential consequences, where before, if it was just 2 or 3 people, I know that you're going to catch me if I'm defecting, and not shouldering my share of the burden. I'm sure you've experienced this sort of situation before, where you have large groups of people and it's really hard to choose a restaurant, right? To all converge on a solution, or everybody sort of throws money into the pot to pay for something, and suddenly the money's coming up short. So intuitively, I think we've seen this happen. The more people that are involved in the process, the more it just doesn't work quite as well. But I want to stress that that's not the only way the public goods provision can work. There's a variety of different public goods kinds of situations. So if we're thinking about asteroid defense, we don't all have to contribute to asteroid defense. Probably, hopefully, if we're facing a threat of an asteroid impact, it's one asteroid. And not everybody needs to throw resources into deflecting the asteroid. We just need somebody somewhere to say, I'm going to shoot a missile at that thing and push it off course. So the fact that NASA is doing that right now means that the rest of the world can basically just sort of sit on its hands and say, we don't have to contribute. NASA's got this asteroid defense thing taken care of. So that's what we call a best shot kind of provision model, where we just really need somebody to do it, and it doesn't matter what everybody else does. Whereas other situations are weakest link provision of public goods, where literally everybody has to contribute for this to work. And if somebody messes up or somebody doesn't contribute, the whole thing breaks down. And so disease control, invasive species control, flood mitigation, a lot of those things all have that weakest link piece, where it's going to fall apart based on the minimum contribution that somebody makes. And we also sort of experience the outcome of that. There's a third pattern that I'd like to talk about in terms of public goods provision, which I guess I'm calling here the collective action problem, but I don't know if that's quite the right term. It's more the problem of getting over the threshold. And so in this scenario, again, I'm choosing whether I contribute or I don't contribute, and I'm thinking about that in terms of what the rest of society is doing, whether the rest of society is contributing or not contributing. And if the rest of society is not contributing, then it's a waste of my resources, just as it was before. But if society is contributing, if other people are throwing in and we're getting that public good, then my contribution actually ends up bearing additional fruit. I'm going to actually get more return by contributing than not contributing. And so in this situation, my rational the choice I'm going to make really hinges on whether or not I believe enough contributions are going to be made to provide the public good, and my efforts are not going to be wasted, or whether I believe that the whole effort's going to fail and there's no point in me, wasting my resources on something that's not going to happen. And I think I have a really good illustration of this, and it has to do with fusion. Fusion research would be a huge breakthrough for humanity, but we really don't know how to do it, and to test it at scale ends up being really expensive. And so a number of years ago, a coalition of, I think, 11 countries got together, and they each threw a couple billion into a project to test at scale an idea for fusion power. I think that it's based in France. France threw in like an extra $1 billion to get it based in France. And the idea involves taking lasers and shooting them at little, I guess, packets of something, hydrogen, superheating them, causing sort of fusion chain reaction, and then retargeting new packets of hydrogen to kind of keep that process going at a sustainable pace. And so they're testing this idea, and in order for it to work, they have to get the lasers just right, they have to get the hydrogen packets just right. There's all, hundreds of different things that have to work in order for this thing to make sense. Now, if we step back from that, and I'm a researcher and I'm thinking about, researching hydrogen packets, somebody might reasonably ask me, well, what's the point of that? What benefit do we have? Why would you do that? And if there's not this facility in France that's targeting hydrogen packets with lasers and trying to create sort of, a positive net energy output, I don't have an answer to that. There's no reason why I would do that. There's no reason at all why researching the better production of hydrogen packets is something that would make sense for anybody to do, and nobody would do it. But once we've built that facility, Then all sorts of additional research on lasers and targeting and these hydrogen packets and all the little pieces that can refine this and make this better and make this more likely to be successful, suddenly that research makes sense. And so the problem isn't so much that we all want a free ride. It's that we need a context in which it makes sense for us to cooperate. And we need the confidence to get there. And sometimes that takes an initial push so we all can say, now that we have that facility, now I can do these other things that I wanted to do. Okay. Again, I get really excited about public goods. I'm going to pivot now to sort of a slightly different question about who should contribute. Once we sort of have the idea that maybe not everybody has to contribute. In fact, some people might be tempted to free ride. Does that doom public goods? Well, it's oftentimes argued that wealthy actors are expected to contribute to public goods provision because they're able to contribute more, and because they're able to contribute more, if they're choosing to free ride, the effort is less likely to be successful. And so in the context of the NATO alliance, the United States has historically spent far more in its military defense and contributed far more in terms of dollars and machinery and equipment to the NATO alliance than Belgium. But that's fine. If Belgium decides that it's not going to contribute significantly to the NATO alliance is still going to function. It's still going to have a credible deterrent. If the United States decides it's not going to contribute significantly to the NATO alliance atrophies and isn't able to provide an effective deterrent. And so there's that idea, particularly in international politics, that large actors with lots of resources, if they're not on board with an effort, it's likely not going to succeed just because of how important they end up being in a lot of these public goods provision efforts. In other situations, there might be actors who are benefiting in specific ways from providing a public good, that they're getting something specific out of it. I think a lot of public goods research in international relations focuses on peacekeeping, and there's been research that has shown that countries contribute to peacekeepers for a variety of reasons. One is sometimes they're trying to professionalize their military by giving them exposure to international military operations, where they can learn from officers in other countries. Other countries use peacekeeping as a way to shuffle off problematic officers that maybe they worry are going to cause a coup. So there's all sorts of reasons why you might say, I'm going to contribute to that public good. I'm going to get a private benefit out of that. And sometimes that's even built into the structure of how we do public goods provision. So again, sticking with the idea of peacekeeping, the UN system has set up a peacekeeping structure where wealthy countries contribute in terms of cash, but mostly poor countries contribute in terms of personnel. And the way that this works is that the UN pays about $1,000 per peacekeeper per month. Which wouldn't cover the cost to the United States of fielding a soldier in a peacekeeping operation. But Pakistan ends up making money on peacekeeping. For every peacekeeper that they send, they actually end up pocketing a couple $100 of just cash from the UN. And this ends up working really well. That places that have a natural advantage to provide labor at relatively cheap cost, military labor at relatively cheap cost, are able to do that, and they're able to be compensated for that. And wealthy countries that would have to spend much, much more to field peacekeepers from their own countries are able to contribute to that effort at a cost well below what they would ever be able to achieve if they were doing everything themselves. And so that sort of burden sharing, or maybe finding your comparative advantage in public goods provision, can be really effective. That finding the way that you can contribute that brings on board the skills and resources that your country has can make a big difference. And so another place that we've seen this, Germany oftentimes contributes to peacekeeping operations by sending in technicians who can work communication equipment, or who can help set up the logistics systems. The United States oftentimes does troop transport because the United States already has global troop transport capabilities. Japan will sometimes do medical support. So they don't deploy military forces abroad, but they can still contribute in non-lethal ways that are important for making that operation successful. And so not everybody has to contribute identically or even make the same kind of contributions. There's ways for countries to play to their strengths and make that process a little bit more efficient.